He walked into a five-star hotel with grease under his fingernails and a folded paper crane in his pocket. And by the time he walked out, three men were on the floor. A criminal network was unraveling, and nobody in that lobby would ever forget his name. If you've ever been looked down on for how you look, where you come from, or what you do for a living, this story is for you. Stay until the end. And if this moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Riker Steele drove his daughter to the Aurelia Grand Hotel, he almost didn't go. Not because he was nervous. He'd been in situations that would make most men's hands shake so badly they couldn't hold a pen, and he'd walk through all of them without flinching. No, what made him hesitate that Tuesday morning was something smaller and more honest than fear. It was the look on Ella's face when she climbed into the passenger seat of his truck and immediately rolled down the window, then just as immediately rolled it back up because the October air had teeth in it, and she didn't have a proper coat yet because he hadn't gotten around to replacing the one she'd outgrown. She was 10. She shouldn't have to think about things like that. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, the way kids say it when they're not fine, but they've decided not to make it your problem. He let it go. Pulled out of the driveway of their rental house on Cortlandt Street, a narrow two-bedroom with a furnace that made a sound like a dying animal every time it kicked on, and headed toward the center of the city. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 that had earned every one of its rust spots. The heater worked on one setting, which was aggressive, and after about 4 minutes, both of them had stripped down to their base layers and cracked the windows just a fraction to let the cold back in as a counterbalance. Ella had her backpack on her lap. He knew what was in it. Graph paper, a pencil case, 2 library books she'd already finished but hadn't returned yet, and the small square of origami paper she carried everywhere, pale blue, the size of a playing card, which she would, at some point during the day, fold into a paper crane and slip into his jacket pocket without making a thing of it. She'd been doing it since she was 7. He couldn't remember exactly when or why it started, only that one afternoon she'd pressed one into his chest pocket before he left for a job and said, very seriously, "So you come back?" He hadn't made a joke out of it. He just nodded and said, "Okay," and driven away, and by the time he was 2 miles down the road, he'd had to pull over for a minute because something in his chest had done something unexpected and he needed a moment before he could see the road clearly again. That was 3 years ago. He hadn't missed a single day since. The Aurelia Grand was on the upper end of 5th District, where the city started pretending it was somewhere else entirely. Wider sidewalks, fewer fast food signs, the kind of storefronts that didn't put prices in the window because if you had to ask, you didn't belong there. Riker had been in that neighborhood plenty of times. He'd replaced the HVAC in the Weston Towers 3 blocks south. He'd done the ductwork for a private club on Alderman Street that smelled like old money and leather. He knew how to move through those spaces without making anybody nervous. He kept his head down, he did his work, he left. But he'd never been to the Aurelia Grand itself. He'd driven past it plenty of times and registered it the way you register a landmark. Impressive, indifferent, not for him. 16 stories of pale stone with brass fixtures and a facade that had been cleaned so recently it almost glowed. A red awning stretched over the main entrance with the hotel's name in gold lettering, and a doorman in a dark green coat and white gloves stood at the glass doors like a piece of furniture that had learned to stand upright. He found the parking structure 2 blocks east and took the ticket from the machine and wound up 3 levels before he found a space. Ella was quiet the whole time. "You don't have to come in if you don't want to," he said. "I can leave the truck running. I want to come. It might take a while, the contract review. Sometimes they—" "Dad?" She looked at him with those dark eyes she'd gotten from her mother. The only good thing her mother had left behind, in Riker's opinion, though he never said that out loud. "I want to come." He nodded, got out of the truck. He was wearing what he always wore to contract meetings. Dark work pants, a collared shirt that had been ironed the night before and had held up reasonably well, and a brown canvas jacket with 2 pockets on the front and a zipper that caught sometimes. He'd checked himself in the bathroom mirror that morning the way he always did, not out of vanity but out of habit, the same way he checked exits when he walked into a room, checked the sight lines, checked for anything that didn't fit. Force of habit. Old training. The shirt was clean. The jacket was worn but not embarrassing. His boots had been wiped down. He'd left his company vest in the truck because he knew the Aurelia Grand wasn't going to want to look at that in their lobby. Still, he knew how he looked. He knew it the way you know something you've made peace with. The roughness of his hands, the faint scar along his jaw, the way he carried himself with a kind of deliberate stillness that made some people uncomfortable without them being able to say exactly why. He was a big man, not bulky, but solid. The kind of solid that came from spending years putting your body through things it wasn't designed to endure and finding out it endured them anyway. He had the face of someone who'd seen things they couldn't describe at parties. He was 35 years old and looked, depending on the day, somewhere between 32 and 42. Ella fell into step beside him and slipped her hand into his without comment. The lobby of the Aurelia Grand was exactly what it was supposed to be. High ceilings with pendant lighting that dropped gold light onto marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Arrangements of white flowers on dark tables. Real flowers, not the silk kind. In tall vases that probably cost more than Riker's monthly truck payment. The check-in desk was a long curved piece of dark wood with brass inlays and 3 staff members standing behind it in matching charcoal blazers with the hotel's crest on the breast pocket, each one groomed to a standard that felt almost aggressive. A sitting area to the left had low upholstered chairs in cream and sage green, occupied by guests who had the relaxed posture of people who had never once worried about a heating bill. Soft music played from somewhere invisible. It wasn't loud enough to identify, but it was exactly loud enough to make the silence feel expensive. Riker and Ella stepped inside. He felt the shift immediately. Not anything dramatic, not anything you could photograph, just a slight realignment in the room's energy, the way a conversation changes register when someone unexpected walks in. One of the staff at the check-in desk looked up, registered them, and looked back down with a particular kind of neutrality that was its own kind of message. A man in a suit near the elevator did a slow, unconcealed scan from Riker's boots to his jacket. A woman seated in one of the cream chairs glanced over the top of her phone, made a face like she'd bitten into something slightly off, and went back to her screen. Ella tightened her grip on his hand. He felt it. He walked to the front desk. One of the staff, young man, early 20s, hair gelled into submission, looked up and put on the kind of smile that hoteliers practice in mirrors. "Good morning. Do you have a reservation?" "Maintenance contract meeting," Riker said. "Steel services. I have an appointment at 10 with someone in facilities management. Darren Chu, I think." The young man typed something, looked at the screen, typed again. His expression didn't shift, but there was something in the pause. "That would be the service contractor appointment," he said, with a very slight emphasis on the word service. "Yes, if you'll have a seat in the waiting area, I'll let Mr. Chu know you're here. He's in a call currently." "Sure." And a brief flick of his eyes to Ella. "Is she with you?" "She's my daughter." "Of course." The smile again. "There's a seating area just to the right." Riker thanked him and led Ella to the chairs. He chose 2 in a corner, habit, with a sight line to the entrance and the desk both. He sat with his jacket on. Ella sat beside him and unzipped her backpack, pulled out one of her library books, and opened it to a dog-eared page. They waited. The first comment he couldn't ignore came about 12 minutes in. There were 2 women seated diagonally across the sitting area, late 40s, the kind of careful put-together that cost a lot of money to look effortless. One of them had been watching Riker and Ella since they sat down with a quiet, undisguised curiosity that had slowly curdled into something else. She leaned toward her companion, said something behind her hand, and they both laughed in that compressed nose-exhale way that's designed to be audible without being obvious. Riker had heard it before. He looked at the wall. He'd gotten good at that. But Ella had heard it too. He knew because she turned a page she hadn't been reading. Then one of the women said, not quietly enough, "I don't know why they don't have a separate entrance for that kind of thing." The other one murmured something back. More laughter. Ella's jaw tightened. She was 10, and she was trying very hard not to show it, which made it worse somehow. The effort of a child deciding not to let adults see that they'd landed a hit. He'd seen that face before, and it never got easier. "Hey," he said quietly. "Look at me." She looked up from the book. "Don't give them that," he said. "What they think of us isn't any of our business." "I know," she said, and then after a beat, It's still mean. Yeah. He didn't argue with that. It is. She went back to the book. A few minutes later, without making a production of it, she reached into her bag, took out the square of pale blue origami paper, and began folding. A man appeared from the direction of the elevators around 10:20, late, though he didn't acknowledge it. Mid-40s, receding hairline, a button-down that was slightly too small across the shoulders in a way that suggested recent weight gain. He scanned the lobby, found Riker, and crossed the room with the walk of a man who has power over a small domain and knows it. "Mr. Steele?" He did not extend his hand. "Darren Chu, sorry for the wait. If you'll follow me to the conference room. Actually, we'll need to do this quickly. I've got a board prep at 11:15. Riker stood. "Not a problem." Chu looked at Ella, then back at Riker, with the particular expression of a man trying to decide how to say something without saying it. "She'll need to wait here," he said. "We can't have—" "She's fine in the lobby," Riker said. "She won't bother anyone." "It's not about that. It's a—" Chu paused, recalibrated. "Policy. Non-staff in meeting areas." Riker looked at Ella. She was already looking at him. "I'll be right over there," he said. "You can see me the whole time." She nodded. She went back to the crane. He followed Chu. The conference room was small and smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. Chu dropped a manila folder on the table and sat down across from Riker and immediately pulled out his phone and glanced at it before Riker had even opened the folder. It was a standard HVAC maintenance contract, annual service, emergency response protocols, parts pricing, liability coverage. The kind of document Riker had signed 50 times, though usually the other party at least pretended to be present for the process. "There are a few terms I want to talk through," Riker said. "Sure, whatever you need." Chu was still looking at the phone. "The emergency response window on page 4. It says 48 hours. My standard is 24. I've got the team to back that up." Chu looked up. "The hotel's prior contractor was at 72. "I'm not your prior contractor." A short pause. Chu studied him for a moment, not with hostility exactly, more with the vague surprise of a man who'd expected less pushback from this particular source. "Fine," he said. 24. Legal will mark it up." "Page 7, the parts markup clause," Riker said. "It's set at 30% over wholesale. I'll do 15. Standard in the industry is—" "I know what the standard is. I'm offering 15. The difference comes back to you in response time and quality of work. I'm not a broker. I'm a technician." Chu looked at him for another moment, then made a note. "I'll pass it to procurement." "Appreciate it." They worked through the remaining terms in about 20 minutes. Chu, to his credit, was efficient when he paid attention. And somewhere around the third item, he'd stopped checking his phone. Riker couldn't tell if it was because the terms were more substantive than he'd expected, or because he'd simply run out of patience for divided attention. Either way, by the time they reached the signature page, the atmosphere had shifted from dismissal to something closer to neutral respect, which was as much as Riker ever expected from situations like this. He signed. Chu signed. They shook hands. Chu's grip firm, deliberate, like he'd decided to commit to the gesture. "Good work on the Caldwell Tower job," Chu said, as Riker was gathering his copy of the contract. "We looked at your references. They were solid." "Thank you." "How long have you been doing this?" Riker considered the question. "About 6 years." "Before that?" A brief pause. "Government work," he said. "Different kind." Chu nodded the way people nod when they sense a door they're not going to be invited through. "Well, we'll be in touch about the onboarding." "Sounds good." He walked back into the lobby. Bam. Ella was still in his chair. She had finished the crane. It sat in her palm, pale blue, its wings perfectly symmetrical, its beak pointed at a slight upward angle the way she always folded them. She looked up when she heard his boots on the marble. "Done?" she asked. "Done." She held up the crane. He bent slightly and she tucked it into the left chest pocket of his jacket with 2 fingers, the way you'd handle something fragile. She patted the pocket once, which was how she always finished the gesture, and then picked her book back up. He sat beside her. He should have said they could leave then. The contract was signed. The meeting was done. There was no reason to linger. But Ella had relaxed in the chair, and he didn't want to rush her, and if he was honest, the lobby had quieted somewhat. The two women who'd been laughing were gone. The man in the suit by the elevator was gone. What remained was the low music and the marble and the hum of a building running on money. He didn't check his watch. He just sat, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, and let the morning be quiet for a minute. That's when he heard the woman's voice. Not loud, not screaming. The kind of controlled, tight voice you use when you're trying not to escalate something but you're running out of options. I said no. That's the answer. Please leave me alone. The voice came from the far end of the lobby, past the check-in desk, near a corridor that led, Riker guessed, toward the hotel's event spaces and service entrances. He turned his head. A woman in a black dress was pressed against the wall near the corridor munch entrance. Standing in a loose semicircle around her were three men, not guests. Their posture was too tactical, their attention too focused. Two of them were in the hotel's security uniform, the charcoal blazer and dark pants with laminated badges. The third was in a different configuration of the same aesthetic, blazer, no badge visible, a build that spoke to a professional background in applied force. The man in the middle, the one without the visible badge, the broadest of the three, was standing close to her, not touching, but close. His arms were at his sides, and he had the patient, deliberate stillness of a man who is used to people eventually acquiescing. He was saying something. Riker couldn't hear the words from across the lobby. The woman said again, clearer now, "I'm asking you to step back." He didn't step back. Riker watched for a moment. Not from indifference, he was making a quick, involuntary inventory of the room. Two other guests visible, both looking in that direction, neither moving. Three hotel employees within range, two of whom were actively finding reasons to look at their workstations. One guest near the elevator had his phone half raised, the instinct to record doing battle with the instinct to not get involved. Nobody moved. The woman put her hand flat against the wall behind her. The man in the middle said something else. One of the security officers shifted to her left, blocking a potential exit. Riker stood up. "Dad?" Ella's voice was quiet. "Stay right here," he said. "Don't move from this chair. Can you do that?" She looked at the far end of the lobby, then back at him. Her face was very still. "Yes," she said. He walked. He moved across the marble floor at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the kind of walk that doesn't announce itself. He covered the distance in about 12 seconds. None of the three men noticed him until he was about 10 feet away, at which point the one without the badge, the big one in the middle, turned his head. Riker stopped. He looked at the woman first. She was in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of composed face that was holding its composure through sheer effort. She had a small leather bag at her hip, one hand gripping the strap like a stabilizer. Her eyes met his, just for a moment, and something in them shifted. Not relief exactly, something more like recalibration, like she was updating an assessment. Then he looked at the three men. "She wants you to leave her alone," he said. The man in the middle looked at Riker for a long moment. He had the measured, assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading threats and categorizing them. "This is a private matter," he said. His voice was even, almost bored. "Doesn't look private. I'd suggest you walk away. This doesn't involve you." "She said no twice," Riker said. "That's typically where the involvement starts." One of the security officers, younger, stockier, with the restless energy of someone who was hoping the situation went physical, stepped away from the wall and squared up slightly. "Listen, pal." His voice had the practiced contempt of a man who'd gotten used to that tone working. "You know what you are right now? You're a maintenance guy in a hotel lobby who's about to make a very bad morning into a much worse one. You want to turn around, go pick up your kid, and walk out the front door before this gets complicated." Several people in the lobby had stopped. Riker was aware of them at the periphery of his attention. The man near the elevator had his phone up now. Two guests near the entrance were watching with undisguised interest. "Walk away," someone said. One of the watching guests, casually, like they were commenting on a TV program. Someone else made a low sound that was close to laughter. "Oh, this is going to be good," another voice said. Riker didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the three men in front of him with the particular quality of attention that had nothing performative in it, just a flat, patient focus that was more unnerving than aggression would have been. "Last time," he said to the man in the middle. "Step away from her." The man in the middle looked at him for another moment. Then the corner of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Remove him," he said. The stocky officer moved first. Riker watched him come. He let the officer reach him, let him get a hand on the front of his jacket, and then, with a movement so economical it was almost invisible, he redirected the grabbing arm, rotated his grip, and applied pressure to a very specific point just above the wrist. The officer made a sound that wasn't a word and bent at the knee involuntarily. "Stop," Riker said quietly. The officer stopped. The expression on his face went through several phases rapidly: surprise, pain, recalibration, the dawning recognition that what he'd reached out to grab had not been what he'd expected. The second security officer had come around from the left. Riker heard him. He released the first man's arm, turned into the approach, and dealt with the second officer in two movements that were almost identical in their efficiency. A redirect, a controlled takedown, the officer sitting on the marble floor with the slightly disoriented expression of someone trying to understand what had just happened. He turned back to the man in the middle. The man in the middle had not moved. He was watching Riker with an expression that had changed considerably in the last 15 seconds. The boredom was gone. In its place was something more careful. "Who are you?" he said. Riker didn't answer that. He was watching the man's hands, his weight distribution, the tension across his shoulders. Then the man did something Riker hadn't fully anticipated. He took a half step back, just one, the kind of instinctive withdrawal that the body performs before the mind signs off on it, and his right hand moved toward his jacket in a way that was not the movement of someone reaching for a radio. Riker moved before the hand had traveled 6 inches. What followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The man was large and capable, and not without training. Riker could feel that in the brief, violent geometry of the encounter, the way he attempted to anchor and counterbalance, the discipline in his initial response. But there is a difference between trained and trained by the specific and unforgiving curriculum of men who had operated in places where the consequences of being wrong were final and irreversible. The gap between those two things was not cruelty, it was just physics. The man in the middle was on the floor. All 3 of them were on the floor. Riker straightened up and rolled his sleeve back down. He hadn't fully registered doing it, rolling the sleeve up. It happened somewhere in the middle of the second exchange, when he'd needed the full range of movement across his forearm. Standard, automatic. But the lobby was silent now in a way it hadn't been before. Not the murmuring, distracted silence of a hotel lobby doing normal business. A different kind. The kind of silence that falls when a room has collectively revised its understanding of a situation. He became aware of them looking. Not at him exactly. At his arm. At the sleeve he'd pushed up. At what was on it. Along the inside of his left forearm, among several other marks that were clearly not decorative, was a tattoo. Not large. About 4 inches across. It was a detailed rendering of a bird in flight. Spare, almost geometric, surrounded by a series of symbols that had the quality of a unit insignia, the kind that didn't appear on any publicly searchable military database. A man near the elevator, older, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore suits to breakfast, had gone very still. He was staring at the tattoo with the expression of someone who has just read a word they thought they'd never see again. A hotel employee behind the check-in desk had put his hand down on the counter like he needed the support. Riker pulled his sleeve back down. He turned to the woman in the black dress. She was standing straight now, no longer pressed against the wall. She had her phone in her hand. Her expression had settled into something composed and very clear-eyed. She was watching him with a look that had moved well past recalibration into something he couldn't quite categorize. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." A brief pause. "Are you?" "No." She looked at his arm. The sleeve was down now, covering everything. "That was extraordinary," she said, and she said it the way you say something when you mean it precisely, and don't see the point of dressing it up. "They should have listened the first time," he said. A complicated expression crossed her face. "Yes," she said. "They should have." One of the men on the floor was reaching for something. Riker tracked it, ready, but it was a radio. He said something into it, broken, clipped, the sound of a man who was not entirely sure what to report. From somewhere deeper in the hotel, there was the sound of movement, rapid, purposeful. Across the lobby, Ella sat in the chair with her library book in her lap, and her hands very still, and her eyes on her father. She had watched the whole thing. She had not moved from the chair. When he looked over at her, when the room was still and the three men were on the floor and the woman in the black dress was standing beside him, Ella met his eyes from across the marble floor. She was not crying. She was 10 years old, and her father had walked into that situation the same way he walked into everything, without theater, without hesitation, without making it more than what it was. She understood that. She had her mother's eyes and her father's attention to detail, and she was starting in the slow, incremental way of intelligent children to understand the shape of what he carried. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her book. Her hand moved to the pocket where she'd put the crane, not to take it out, just to check that it was there. It was there. But back across the lobby, the woman in the black dress was making a call. Her voice was low and quick, with the clipped efficiency of someone relaying information to people who were already in motion. When she hung up, she looked at Riker. "My name is Vivian Sinclair," she said. "I'm the CEO of Sinclair Global." She paused. "I don't think you knew that when you came over here." "No," he said. "That matters," she said, more to herself than to him. "That matters quite a lot." He wasn't sure what she meant by that. He looked at the three men on the floor, one conscious and still, the other two beginning the slow process of recovery. None of them were going anywhere fast. "What is this?" he asked. "What were they after?" She hesitated for only a moment. "This hotel is under federal investigation," she said, "for money laundering. I've been gathering evidence for 6 months. Those men work for the ownership group." She glanced at the three figures on the floor. "They were not supposed to know I was here. But they did. Someone told them." Her jaw tightened. "Yes." In the distance, outside the front doors of the Aurelia Grand, there was the sound of vehicles arriving. Not one vehicle, several, with the particular cadence of coordinated deployment. The doorman in the dark green coat opened the door. The first officer through it was in a dark jacket with 3 letters across the back. Then another, then several more. Behind them, in plain clothes, a woman with a federal badge on a lanyard who moved through the lobby with the purpose of someone who had been waiting a long time for this morning. The man near the elevator with the silver hair stood up very slowly and put his hands in front of him. At the check-in desk, one of the staff in the charcoal blazer made a short, quiet sound and then began to cry. The lobby of the Aurelia Grand, which had spent the morning curating an atmosphere of exclusion and elegant indifference, came apart at the seams with the organized efficiency of a very long investigation reaching its conclusion. Riker stood in the middle of it, his jacket still on, the paper crane in his chest pocket, and watched it happen. The Aurelia Grand was done. He didn't know that yet, didn't know the full scope of what Vivian Sinclair had spent 6 months building, didn't know how many threads connected to how many other buildings and accounts, and people in rooms far from this lobby. He didn't know his name was about to be on the news, that the man by the elevator with the phone had been recording, that 37 seconds of footage from a hotel lobby was about to travel faster than anything in his life ever had. He knew only what he could see in front of him, a woman who'd asked 3 times to be left alone, a problem that needed addressing, and his daughter across the room with a paper crane in his pocket and her eyes on her book, patient and steady and exactly where he'd told her to stay. He walked back across the marble floor. Ella looked up when he got close. She studied his face the way kids study their parents' faces, looking for what they're not saying. "Ready to go?" he asked. She looked around at the lobby. The agents, the arrests, the man in the silver suit with his hands in front of him, the woman at the check-in desk crying, the guests standing stunned and uncertain at the edges of the room. Then she looked back at her father. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." She zipped up her backpack and stood, and took his hand, and they walked toward the door. The doorman in the dark green coat held it open for them on the way out. He didn't look dismissive now. He didn't look like a piece of furniture. He looked like a man who had just seen something he was going to think about for a very long time. Riker nodded to him. The man nodded back. They stepped out into the October air. It was cold. Ella didn't have a proper coat yet. He made a mental note to fix that before the week was out. They walked 2 blocks east to the parking structure, took the elevator up 3 levels, found the F150 right where they'd left it. Riker unlocked the doors and Ella climbed in and started rolling the window down out of habit, then stopped, remembered the cold, and left it up. He got in, started the engine. The heater kicked on immediately, aggressive as always. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ella said, quietly, "Those men weren't going to stop." "No," he agreed. "They weren't." "So you stopped them?" "Yeah." She looked out the windshield. "Are you going to be in trouble?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. "Don't know yet," he said. "Maybe not." She nodded. She reached into her bag. Not for the origami paper this time, she'd already done that. The crane was in his pocket. She pulled out her library book and opened it to the dog-eared page. He put the truck in reverse. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "That woman. The one in the black dress." Ella paused. "Is she okay?" He thought about Vivian Sinclair, the composure on her face, the way she'd stood straight the moment the pressure was lifted, the particular quality of her voice when she'd said that matters quite a lot. "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think she's going to be fine." Ella seemed to consider this. She turned a page. "Good," she said. He pulled out of the parking structure and turned south onto Alderman Street, away from the Aurelia Grand, away from the federal vehicles and the arrests and the lobby that was in the process of becoming something else entirely. The crane sat in his chest pocket. The heater ran full blast. He drove his daughter home. The drive home took 22 minutes. Riker knew this because Ella had fallen asleep before they hit the Cortlandt Street Bridge. Her head tipped against the window, the library book still open across her knees. And he'd watched the clock out of a habit he couldn't quite shake. The old instinct to account for time, to know exactly how long a thing had taken and what had happened inside that window. 22 minutes, she was out for all of it. He parked the truck in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the cooling metal tick, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. She'd asked if the woman in the black dress was okay, and then she'd turned a page in her book and not asked anything else. That was Ella. She processed things quietly, internally, in ways he didn't always have access to. He didn't know if that was healthy or not. He suspected it was both, depending on the day. He got out carefully and went around to her side and opened the door and caught the library book before it slid off her lap. He carried her inside. She stirred when he laid her on the couch, but didn't wake, just adjusted her position and pulled her knees up toward her chest, already settled somewhere that wasn't the truck and wasn't the hotel and wasn't the marble lobby with its expensive silence and the 3 men on the floor. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat at the table and looked at his hands. They weren't shaking. They never did, after. That was one of the things the years of training had done to his nervous system. Recalibrated the response curve, flattened the spike that ordinary people felt in the aftermath of violence. He didn't feel the adrenaline dump the way a civilian would. He felt something else instead, something harder to name, a kind of hollow alertness, like a room after a loud noise, the air still carrying the shape of what had filled it. He thought about the tattoo. He thought about the way the silver-haired man by the elevator had stared at it. The recognition on that face, not vague, not uncertain. The sharp and particular recognition of someone who knew exactly what that symbol meant and had believed, until that morning, that they were unlikely to encounter it again outside of a classified briefing. The unit hadn't officially existed. That was the point of it. 14 men, operating under a command structure that had 2 levels of deniability baked in before you even reached the paperwork stage. They had done things in places that didn't have names in news reports, and then they had dispersed, some of them back into civilian life, some into other configurations of the same darkness under different designations, and some into the specific silence that meant they were gone in ways that had no public record. Riker had come back. That was the bald fact of it. He'd come back from that world, not whole, not unmarked, but functional and present, and raising a daughter in a house on Cortlandt Street with a furnace that sounded like a dying animal. He'd been careful. For 6 years he'd been careful. He did his work, he kept his head down, he rolled his sleeves down. This morning he had rolled his sleeve up. He didn't regret it. That wasn't what he was sitting with. What he was sitting with was the knowledge that a thing seen cannot be unseen, that the silver-haired man knew someone who knew someone, and that careful was a relative state that could change overnight. The kettle boiled. He made coffee because he didn't really have tea, and the act of the kettle had been about needing something to do with his hands more than anything else. He sat with the mug and looked out the window at the backyard, a patch of grass that had gone dormant for the season, a fence that needed one of its boards replaced, a birch tree that Ella had started leaving seeds under, even though birds in October were a complicated proposition. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost let it go. Unknown numbers didn't usually have anything good to say, but something made him answer. Mr. Steele. The voice was professional, female, calm in a way that suggested the calm was a practiced and permanent condition. My name is Dana Reeves. I'm the communications director for Sinclair Global. Ms. Sinclair asked me to reach out. He set down the mug. How did you get this number? A brief pause. Ms. Sinclair asked me to pass along that the contract with the Aurelia Grand has been voided under the circumstances, and that Sinclair Global would like to discuss alternative arrangements for the building's maintenance services. I'm also calling to ask if you and your daughter are all right, and to let you know that there will likely be press attention starting in the next few hours. Press attention. There's footage circulating, Dana Reeves said. From this morning. A guest in the lobby recorded approximately 37 seconds of video that has been posted to several platforms. It's gaining traction quickly. Ms. Sinclair thought you should be aware. Riker looked at Ella, still asleep on the couch. Her breathing was even. The library book was on the coffee table where he'd set it. How much traction? He said. As of 15 minutes ago, the original post had 60,000 views. That number is climbing. A careful pause. Mr. Steele, you're in the video. Your face is visible. So is your daughter's. He was quiet for a moment. Ms. Sinclair is holding a press conference at 4 o'clock, Dana continued. She will address the investigation and the events at the hotel this morning. She is not planning to identify you by name unless you give permission. She wanted you to know that. She also wanted you to have the option to speak with her directly before then, if you choose. I don't need to speak at a press conference. She's not asking you to. She's offering a conversation. There's a difference. Another brief pause. She said to tell you, and I'm quoting directly here, tell him I just want to say thank you without a lobby full of people watching. Riker looked at the table. He thought about the woman in the black dress pressed against the wall, the controlled voice asking for something as basic as being left alone, the way nobody in that lobby had moved until he did. Where? He asked. Oh, he arranged for his neighbor, Mrs. Coletti, a 68-year-old retired school librarian who had an arrangement with Riker that involved occasional childcare in exchange for his fixing whatever was currently broken in her house, which was usually several things, to come over and sit with Ella for the afternoon. He told Ella he had a follow-up meeting from the morning, which was true enough, and Ella, who was awake by then and eating cereal at the kitchen table with her library book propped against the cereal box, gave him a look that suggested she was reserving judgment. The crane's still in your pocket, she said. He checked. It was. Good, she said, and went back to her book. The address Dana Reeves had given him was not the Sinclair Global headquarters downtown. It was a smaller building in the Meridian District, a neighborhood of converted warehouse spaces and quiet professional offices that didn't advertise themselves. The kind of place you could have a meeting without it appearing in anyone's calendar. Riker found parking on the street and went in through a glass door into a small reception area with a single desk and a woman who checked his name against something on her screen and led him to an elevator without conversation. 3rd floor. A conference room, different from the one at the Aurelia Grand, warmer somehow, with actual windows and coffee that smelled like it had been made in the last 10 minutes. Vivian Sinclair was already there. She looked different than she had in the lobby. Same composure, but the black dress had been replaced by dark trousers and a gray blazer, and her hair was down. She looked, Riker thought, like a person rather than a role, or more accurately, like the role had been set aside for the length of this particular conversation. She was standing at the window when he came in, and she turned when she heard him and didn't immediately speak, which he appreciated. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." She gestured to the table. They both sat. He took the chair with a sight line to the door. She noticed him do it, but didn't say anything. "Your daughter," she said. "She's all right?" "She's fine. She's tough." She was very calm during... Vivian paused. "During what happened, I noticed her watching from the chair. She didn't move. I told her not to. She listened. She usually does, when it matters." Vivian looked at him for a moment, not appraising exactly, more like she was updating something. "How old is she?" 10. A short silence. Vivian wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I have a nephew who's 10, she said. "He doesn't have that quality of stillness. He's wonderful, but he's not still." "It took her a while to develop it," Riker said. "It wasn't..." He stopped, considered how much of this was relevant. "She had a hard couple of years when she was younger, after her mother left. She learned to be still because still was safer. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to make it so she doesn't need to be." He wasn't sure why he'd said that. He didn't usually offer that kind of information to people he'd known for less than a day. There was something about Vivian Sinclair's manner, a directness that made performance seem pointless, that had led him there before he'd fully decided to go. She didn't respond to it the way he expected. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "that must have been hard," or any of the things people usually said because they were good filler and covered the discomfort of not knowing what else to offer. She just nodded once, like she'd filed it and understood it, and would not make more of it than he'd intended. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said. "What you did this morning..." "You don't have to do the speech," he said. "I mean that respectfully." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not offense, more like a recalibration. "All right," she said. "No speech." She set down the mug. "Can I ask you something instead?" "Go ahead." "The tattoo. The unit insignia." She held his gaze. "I recognized it. I've seen it once before in a briefing that I was not supposed to be in and that I have never officially been in. I know what it means. I know what it represents." A pause. "I'm not going to pretend that I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" "Nothing specific. I just want you to understand that I am aware of the weight of what you did this morning. Not just the physical, the exposure. You showed your hand in a room full of cameras." "I know." "Are you worried about that?" He thought about the silver-haired man, the recognition on his face. "I'm aware of it," he said. "Worried is a different thing." "What's the difference?" "Worried is when you don't know what's coming and you spend energy trying to predict it. Aware is when you know what's possible and you account for it and you move forward anyway." He looked at the window. "I've been aware of a lot of things for a long time. It doesn't slow me down. It just means I don't leave my truck unlocked." Vivian studied him. "You've been out of that world for 6 years. And nobody's come looking." "No." "Do you think that changes now?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the mug in front of him that he hadn't touched yet. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. The unit's officially dissolved. The people who'd care about me existing are mostly occupied with other concerns." A pause. "Or they're gone." "Gone," she repeated quietly. "It's a dangerous line of work." A silence settled between them that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside the windows, the Meridian District was going about its afternoon. A delivery truck making its stop on the opposite corner, a woman in a long coat walking a dog that was interested in everything. "I want to tell you about the investigation," Vivian said. "Not because you're entitled to it, but because what happened this morning is going to be public by 4 o'clock, and some of it touches you, and you should know the shape of it." "All right." She straightened slightly. The roll came back, not stiffly, just as a natural adjustment, the way someone squares their shoulders before they do something they're practiced at. The Aurelia Grand is owned through a network of shell companies that traces back to a private investment group called Meridian Capital Partners. They have nothing to do with this district. They use the name because it's generic and forgettable. She folded her hands on the table. Over the past 4 years, the hotel has been used to launder money for 3 separate organizations, 2 of which have ties to federal cases already under seal. The amounts involved are significant. The mechanism is complex: overvalued service contracts, ghost vendors, falsified occupancy records. But the pattern is consistent once you know what you're looking for. How did you start looking? One of my junior analysts flagged a transaction 2 years ago, a service payment from a Sinclair Global subsidiary to a vendor that didn't exist. Small amount, under $10,000, the kind of thing most people would attribute to a data entry error and move on. Her jaw tightened slightly. I don't move on from data entry errors. So you pulled the thread. I pulled the thread for 6 months, at considerable personal risk, which I understood going in and accepted. She paused. What I did not anticipate was the leak. Someone inside my organization told the ownership group I was at the hotel this morning. Those 3 men were not hotel security performing a routine function. They were sent specifically to intercept me. To do what? I don't know. I don't think they had clear instructions beyond stopping me from leaving with what I had. She touched the leather bag at her hip. She'd brought it, Riker noticed, into the conference room with her. I had documentation, physical and digital both. The kind of thing that's useless if it disappears. Riker looked at the bag. It didn't disappear. No. She met his eyes. It didn't. A beat of silence. The men you put on the floor, she said. The one in the middle, Victor Crane. He is not hotel security. He is a private contractor with a history that the relevant agencies have been trying to formally document for a long time. His arrest this morning is, among other things, a gift to 2 separate federal investigations that have nothing to do with the hotel. Riker absorbed this. So this morning was bigger than a maintenance contract meeting? The corner of her mouth moved. Yes, it was. And the press conference at 4. I'm announcing the conclusion of the investigation and the arrests. I'm also announcing the cooperation of my organization with the federal case going forward. There will be questions about how the confrontation in the lobby connects to everything else. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to say that I was assisted by a private citizen who intervened when 3 men were preventing me from leaving, and that without that intervention, the morning could have ended very differently. I am not going to name you unless you tell me I can. What I'm going to say is true, and it's the complete picture, and it will be enough. What about the video? The video is already out. I can't control that. She paused. Your face is visible. So is your sleeve, the portion of it. She chose the next words carefully. The tattoo is not visible in the footage. I've reviewed it. The angle doesn't catch it, but people will want to know who you are. And when they find out I'm a maintenance contractor from Cortlandt Street, some of them will find that more remarkable, she said. Not less. He thought about that. He thought about Ella at the kitchen table with her cereal and her library book. He thought about the furnace that sounded like a dying animal and the fence board that needed replacing and the coat she didn't have yet. He thought about how small and specific and ordinary his life was, and how much he wanted to protect that ordinariness, and how completely this morning had complicated that. What do you need from me? He said. Nothing. I genuinely need nothing from you. She held his gaze. I wanted to have this conversation because you did something significant today, and you deserve to know its full weight, and because... A pause. A small thing crossed her face that was less polished than everything else had been. Because the way you came across that lobby, and the way you talked to your daughter afterward, and the way you walked out of there. I've spent 6 months in that investigation, surrounded by people who calculate everything before they move. You just moved. And I wanted to look you in the eye and say, thank you for that. He didn't say you're welcome. He didn't say it was nothing. Both would have been wrong. I hope the press conference goes the way you need it to, he said. So do I. He stood, she stood. The maintenance contract, she said, for the building. The Aurelia Grand won't be operational for some time, possibly a long time, depending on how the seizure proceedings go. But Sinclair Global has 3 other properties in the city that use outside service contractors. If you want to submit a proposal for any of them, I'll make sure it reaches the right desk. He looked at her. That's not why I came across the lobby. I know, she said. That's why I'm offering. He thought about it for a moment. It wasn't charity. She'd been clear about that, or clear enough. It was the particular way of a person in a position of power acknowledging a debt they couldn't pay in any currency that mattered and offering instead the only practical thing they had. Send the addresses to Dana Reeves, he said. I'll put something together. She'll have them to you tonight. He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He put it on. The crane shifted in the chest pocket, light as paper, which it was. He was in his truck, 3 blocks from the building, when his phone buzzed again. Not Dana Reeves this time, a number he recognized, one he'd had saved under a false name for several years out of a caution that had started to feel almost superstitious. He stared at it for a moment before he answered. Marcus, he said. Riker. The voice on the other end was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned decades ago that urgency was a resource you spent carefully. I saw something interesting today. Riker looked out at the street. A woman was walking the same dog he'd seen from the conference room window. Apparently it was still interested in everything. I figured someone would call, Riker said. I'm calling as a friend, Marcus said. I want you to understand that. I do. The video doesn't show the mark. I checked. Vivian Sinclair told me the same thing. A short pause. You had a conversation with her. This afternoon. How is she? Sharp, careful. She spent 6 months building a case on her own, and she was right about all of it. She usually is. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The man in the middle, Victor Crane. She told me about him. There are people who are very pleased about this morning's outcome, Marcus said. People in positions that don't have public titles. Crane has been a problem for a long time. The specific nature of how he ended up on a marble floor in a hotel lobby is going to be of interest to some of them. How much interest? The concerning kind or the grateful kind, depending on which room you're in. Marcus paused. You were careful for 6 years, Riker. That's a long time to be careful. I know. Are you going to stay careful? He thought about that word again. Careful. And what Vivian had said about the difference between worried and aware, except that he'd been the one to say it. I'm going to stay present, he said. That's about as much as I can commit to. Marcus made a sound that was almost a laugh. Your daughter good? She's fine. Good. A pause. She's the reason to stay present. Don't let the morning make you forget that. I haven't forgotten that for a single day in 10 years, Riker said. It's the one thing I haven't forgotten. Marcus was quiet. I'll be in touch, he said. If anything changes. All right. Take care of yourself. The call ended. Riker sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. The street outside was ordinary, afternoon light going bronze and flat, the temperature dropping the way it did this time of year in the late afternoon, the dog and its owner disappearing around the corner. He started the truck. He had to stop at the hardware store on the way home. The fence board. He'd been putting it off for 2 weeks, and there was no good reason to keep putting it off. He had the dimensions already, had written them on the back of a receipt that was currently in his jacket pocket along with the paper crane, and he could stop at Henley's on Oak Street and have it cut to size and be home before 5. Ella would want dinner. Mrs. Coletti would have helped her start on homework. The furnace would make it sound when the evening temperature dropped enough to trigger the thermostat. He'd fix the furnace properly sometime in November, when he had a gap between jobs. Ordinary things. Specific and small and ordinary. He pulled out into traffic. At 4 o'clock, in a room he would never see, Vivian Sinclair stood in front of cameras and microphones and spoke for 23 minutes about a criminal network and a 6-month investigation and a morning that had ended the way it needed to end. She was precise and composed, and she did not mention his name. She did say, and this was the part that would be clipped and reposted and played on the evening news, the 8 seconds that would be replayed more than any other part of her statement. She did say, the intervention that made this morning's outcome possible came from a private citizen who had no knowledge of the investigation, no stake in the outcome, and no reason to act beyond the simple recognition that something wrong was happening and nobody else was doing anything about it. She paused. That's rarer than it should be. Riker heard about those 8 seconds later that evening, when a clip of them showed up on his phone via a text from an old colleague who'd seen the press conference. He watched it once, put his phone face down on the kitchen table, and went back to the dinner he was making. Ella was at the kitchen table doing long division. She had 3 problems left and a look of determined concentration that meant she was either close to the answer or close to throwing the pencil. "Dinner in about 10 minutes, he said. "'Kay?" She erased something, rewrote it. "Dad, how do you know when you have the right quotient?" "Check your multiplication." She made a face. "That's not a direct answer." "That's the direct answer. Multiply your quotient by the divisor. If it doesn't match the dividend, it's wrong." She looked at the paper. Tried it. Made another face, different from the first one. The face of someone who has discovered that the process is less satisfying than they'd hoped but does in fact work. "That's annoying," she said. "Most things that work are." She went back to the problem. The furnace kicked on, made it sound. He stirred the pot on the stove. Outside, the night was coming down cold and clear on Cortlandt Street, the way October nights did in this city. Fast and total, no gentle transition, just the light going and the cold arriving as if they'd made a prior arrangement. The fence board he'd bought from Henley's was leaning against the garage. He'd get to it Saturday. The coat he needed to buy Ella was on a list on his phone. He'd been paid 3 days ago, and the account was in decent shape, and the coat was manageable. He thought about what Marcus had said. Take care of yourself. The version of that advice that meant more than the surface of it. The version that meant don't let one morning become the thing that unravels the 6 years of quiet you've built. He was still thinking about it when Ella looked up from her homework and said, with the abruptness of a thought she'd been sitting on for a while, "That woman, Vivian, do you think she knew how scared she was?" He turned from the stove. Ella was looking at him with genuine curiosity, not distress, just the focused, earnest look of a kid trying to understand something. "What do you mean?" he said. She didn't look scared, but she had to be scared. 3 guys against 1 person. Ella put her pencil down. "I think she was scared, but she was holding it so nobody could see. Because if she looked scared, they'd think she was weak." A pause. "Was I right?" He thought about the flat wall behind Vivian Sinclair's eyes, the grip on the bag strap. "Yeah," he said. "I think you were right." Ella nodded. "I thought so." She picked the pencil back up. "It's harder to be brave when you're scared and you can't show it," she said. "It takes more." She went back to her long division. He turned back to the stove. The pot was beginning to simmer. The video hit 2 million views sometime during the night while Riker was asleep. He didn't know that until 6:14 the next morning when he came downstairs in a t-shirt and work pants to start coffee and found 3 missed calls on his phone, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 from a local area code that turned out to be a television news producer named Greg Hallis, who had left a voicemail that was professional in structure and aggressive in intent. The message of a man who understood that the first person to reach a subject often got the story. Riker deleted it and made coffee. By the time Ella came downstairs at 7, backpack already on, hair still damp from the shower she'd taken without being asked, a recent development he'd learned not to comment on lest it somehow reverse itself. The missed call count had climbed to 9. He'd turned the phone face down on the counter and left it there. "You're not going to answer those," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." She poured herself a glass of orange juice and looked at the phone the way you look at something that belongs to a situation you're not entirely sure about. "Is it because of yesterday?" "Some of it." "Are you famous now?" He looked at her. She had a very straight face. He couldn't tell if she was being sincere or deadpan, and sometimes with Ella, the answer was both simultaneously. "No," he said. "Okay." She drank her juice. "Mrs. Coletti showed me the video last night, after you went to the hardware store." She paused. She cried a little bit. He was quiet for a moment. "How did you feel watching it?" Ella considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Weird," she said. "Like watching someone else but knowing it's not someone else." She set the glass down. "You look different on a phone screen." "Different how?" "Bigger," she said. "But also like, I don't know, like you're very far away even though you're right there." She picked up her backpack strap and adjusted it. Can I go to Mara's after school? The transition was so clean and complete that it took him a half second to follow it. Mara's mom know about it? I texted her. And? She said yes. She's making lasagna. Be home by 8. 7:30, she said, which was what she said when she intended to be home by 7:45, and wanted the psychological buffer of having negotiated down from 8. He'd figured this pattern out about a year ago and found it more charming than he let on. 7:30, he agreed. She grabbed a piece of toast off the plate he'd made and was out the door. He had 2 jobs that day, a commercial unit inspection on the north side in the morning and a callback on a residential install in the Decker neighborhood that had been giving him problems for 3 weeks, a stubborn airflow issue in a split level that he'd traced to a duct configuration the original installer had done wrong and then tried to fix wrong, and then apparently given up on and hidden behind drywall, which was the kind of thing that made him quietly furious in a way that had nothing to do with the client and everything to do with a professional standard that some people just didn't have. He drove to the north side job and did it, and it was fine. The unit was running within acceptable parameters, needed a filter change and a capacitor he had in the truck, and the building manager, a heavy-set woman named Priscilla, who remembered him from 2 years prior, met him at the roof access and made no mention of videos or news coverage, and just talked about the capacitor and whether she needed a full-service contract or just a quarterly check-in. He recommended quarterly. She agreed. They shook hands and he went back down. Normal work. He was grateful for it. The Decker job took longer. He was in the crawl space behind the false wall in the downstairs hallway for over an hour, which was an hour of his life he would not look back on fondly. Tight, dim, the original ductwork in a configuration that could only have made sense to someone who had either never studied fluid dynamics or had studied them and held them in contempt. He fixed it. It took 2 sections of new duct, 3 adjusted hangers, and a vocabulary of quiet profanity that he kept entirely internal because the homeowner's 8-year-old was doing homework at the kitchen table 6 feet away on the other side of the wall. He was washing his hands at the utility sink in the homeowner's garage when his phone rang again. This time the number was Dana Reeves. The addresses, she said when he answered. Ms. Sinclair asked me to follow up. She wanted to make sure you received them. I got them. I'll have proposals ready by the end of the week. Good. A brief pause. Mr. Steele, I'm also calling because Miss Sinclair has received a formal request from a journalist at the National Register. Investigative Desk. The reporter's name is Claire Adeyemi. She's been covering the Meridian Capital Partners story for 8 months from the financial angle, and she's interested in speaking with you. I'm not doing interviews. Ms. Sinclair thought you'd say that. She asked me to tell you that Claire Adeyemi is not the kind of journalist who will run a story without your participation. She'll run it either way, but your participation shapes what it says. And the story she's going to write about you in yesterday morning is going to be written whether you talk to her or not. Riker looked at the garage wall. There was a child's drawing pinned to the corkboard above the workbench, a house with a sun and a lopsided tree, the kind of drawing that ends up on fridges and garage walls, and sometimes in boxes labeled things you keep. He looked at it for a moment. What does Sinclair think I should do? She thinks you should do what you're comfortable with, but she also said, Dana paused. She said that a story told without your voice is a story told about you, not by you. She wanted you to have that distinction clearly. Tell her I'll think about it. I'll tell her. He hung up. He finished washing his hands. He looked at the drawing on the wall for another moment, the lopsided tree, the enormous sun, and then he picked up his tools and packed the truck and drove back across town. The call he hadn't expected came at 2:17 in the afternoon when he was parked outside a parts supplier on Whitmore Avenue waiting for a belt drive that had to be ordered from the distribution center and was supposedly in stock. The number had a 703 area code. He knew what 703 meant. He'd known enough people who called from that area code over the years that the prefix had acquired a particular quality, the way certain smells or sounds carry associations that aren't entirely comfortable. He answered. Mr. Steele. Male voice, older, the kind of measured diction that suggested a career of choosing words in rooms where words had consequences. My name is Arthur Briggs. I'm calling from the office of I know what 703 is, Riker said. A brief pause. Then you understand the nature of this call. I understand you're federal, you tracked down my number inside of 24 hours, and you're calling about yesterday. That's about as far as I've gotten. That's accurate enough. A pause that was not discomfort. It was the pause of a man making a considered decision about how much direct language to use. The events at the Aurelia Grand yesterday intersect with several ongoing matters that fall under our office's purview. Victor Crane specifically. Are you familiar with that name beyond what you heard from Ms. Sinclair? No? His arrest yesterday creates a significant opportunity. The physical evidence of his conduct, the witness accounts, the footage, provides leverage in a case that has been moving very slowly for a very long time. A pause. Your role in yesterday's events is material to that case. I put 3 men on a floor, Riker said. That's my role. You did so in a way that suggests a particular background. I run an HVAC company. Mr. Steele. The voice was patient. We're not interested in your background for punitive reasons. I want to be direct about that. What we are interested in is whether you would be willing to provide a formal statement about what you witnessed and what occurred. Nothing beyond that. No extended involvement. A statement, reviewed by counsel of your choosing, that goes into the record. Riker watched a forklift move a pallet of equipment through the supply yard. The driver had his phone balanced on the steering column, which was inadvisable. What does the record do with it? He asked. It strengthens the case against Crane and, by extension, against the ownership group. The statement would be sealed from public access. Your name would not appear in any publicly available court document. And Ella? A pause. I'm sorry? My daughter was in that lobby. She's 10. Her face is in the footage. We have no interest in your daughter and no reason to involve her in anything. She was a bystander. She's always a bystander, Riker said. That's the whole point. I need her to stay one. That's a reasonable position, Briggs said, and one we can work with. I'll call you back. Of course, I'll call you back, Riker said again, and ended the call. He sat in the truck and looked at the supply yard and thought about the way things accumulated. One morning, one decision, one rolled-up sleeve, and how the accumulation had a direction to it that was hard to redirect once it started moving. The belt drive he'd been waiting for never materialized. The parts supplier came out to the truck window personally to tell him the distribution center had made an error and the part was actually coming from a secondary location and would be another day. Riker thanked him without particular emotion and pulled out of the lot. He called Marcus on the way back across town. 703 called, he said when Marcus picked up. I expected that. Arthur Briggs? Yes. He's clean, Marcus said. Old school, career agency, not the kind who plays both sides. If he said sealed from public record, he means it. You know him. I know of him. He's been after Crane's network for 3 years. Yesterday was a significant break for him. A pause. Riker, giving a statement in this context is not the same as reactivating. It's a one-time thing. A deposition, essentially. I know the difference. Do you want to give it? He thought about Victor Crane on the marble floor. He thought about the 3 years Briggs had apparently spent on this. He thought about the woman at the check-in desk who had cried when the federal agents came through the door, not from guilt, he'd thought at the time, but from relief. The particular crying of someone who had known something was wrong for a long time and hadn't known how to say it. Yeah, he said. I'll give it. Good. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How's the rest of it? The attention? Manageable. I'm not engaging with it. The journalist. Dana Reeves called. I told her I'd think about it. Think about it carefully, Marcus said. Adeyemi is thorough. If she's writing the story regardless, your version of events is better than her constructed version. That's what Sinclair said. Sinclair's not wrong about much. A pause. How was she, by the way? The meeting. Honest, Riker said. She didn't try to make more of it than it was. That's unusual in her position. I noticed. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a comment and not quite agreement, somewhere between the two. Take the statement meeting with Briggs. Think about the journalist. And Riker, I know. Do you? He looked out at the road. The afternoon light was doing its October thing again, coming in low and amber and casting long shadows from everything it touched. An ordinary street in an ordinary city in a life he had built with two hands out of very specific components, which were a job that was his own and a daughter who was his and a house with a furnace he could fix himself. Ella asked me last night if Vivian knew how scared she was, he said. In the lobby. I told her yes. Ella said it takes more to be brave when you can't show the fear. He paused. She's 10 years old. Marcus was quiet. I know what I'm doing, Riker said. I know what I'm protecting. All right, Marcus said. I believe you. He made the appointment with Arthur Briggs for 2 days later. He called Dana Reeves and got Claire Adiemi's number and sent her a text that said he was willing to have a preliminary conversation, which was a specific and deliberate phrasing that he hoped communicated the limits of his availability without being hostile about it. She texted back within 4 minutes. Yes, preliminary. Your terms, whenever works. Which told him she was either at her desk or hadn't put her phone down since she'd heard he might call. Probably both. That evening, he went to pick up Ella from Mara's house at 7:25, which was 5 minutes early, which he did sometimes when the day had been the kind that made him need to see her sooner rather than later. Mara's mother, a cheerful woman named Janet, who had the particular energy of someone who ran entirely on coffee and genuine affection for the chaos of children, met him at the door and said Ella was getting her shoes and would he like to come in for a minute. He went in. The house smelled like the lasagna and something warm that was probably candles. The kitchen table still had homework spread across it alongside the remains of dinner. 2 other kids were in the living room in front of a television. Janet handed him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one, which he appreciated, and leaned against the counter. So, she said, in the way of someone who has been waiting to say something and is now selecting the version that's least likely to go wrong. Mara showed me the video. I figured. You're a local celebrity, she said. Her words, not mine. She paused. How are you doing with all of it? Fine, he said. And then, because Janet was not the kind of person who accepted that answer from people she knew, it's complicated. I don't want the attention. I did what made sense in the moment, and now it's bigger than the moment. That happens, she said. When the thing you do is right and it's visible, it gets bigger than you want it to. People need it to be bigger because it's the kind of thing they want to believe happens. She stirred her coffee. Doesn't make it easier for you, I know, but that's what it is. Ella appeared from the back of the house with her backpack and her shoes on and one lace not fully tied. She stopped when she saw him and gave him the look. Not surprised because she knew him too well to be surprised, but acknowledging. The look that said she knew why he was 4 minutes early and had already decided not to make an issue of it. Hi, she said. Hi. She said goodbye to Mara, who appeared behind her briefly and waved with the unself-conscious affection of children who are not yet at the age where affection becomes complicated. He thanked Janet for having her. They drove home. The night was cold and clear, and the streetlights on Cortlandt Street had come on, making small islands of orange light in the dark. He parked in the driveway, and they went inside, and the furnace made its sound when the heat kicked on, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about nothing specific. Dad, Ella said from the hallway. Yeah. There was a kid at school today who said he saw the video. She paused. He said you looked like a movie. He waited. I told him you're not a movie, she said. You're just my dad. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. She went upstairs to brush her teeth. He stood in the kitchen until he heard the water running, and then he pulled out his phone and opened the text thread with Claire Adiemi. He looked at it for a moment. Her message sitting there, professional and careful, your terms, whenever works. He thought about a story told without your voice being a story told about you, not by you. He thought about Ella saying you're not a movie, you're just my dad, and how both things were true simultaneously, and how the gap between them was the thing he was going to have to navigate. He typed, tomorrow afternoon, 1 hour. Off the record first, then we decide. She responded in 2 minutes. Agreed. Thank you. He put the phone down. Upstairs, the water stopped running. He heard Ella's footsteps cross the bathroom floor. A pause. Then her bedroom door, the sound of it not quite latching the way it never quite latched, because the frame had settled and he'd been meaning to plane the edge for 6 months. Another thing for the list, he turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The morning of the ADME meeting, he was awake before 5. Not from anxiety. He'd checked himself against that carefully, and it wasn't anxiety. It was the earlier, quieter thing, the alertness that came when a situation had multiple moving parts, and his mind preferred to account for all of them before the day asked him to start managing them. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. He thought about the tattoo. Not with regret, because regret was an indulgence he'd never been able to afford, but with the particular awareness of a man who knows that a thing revealed cannot be unrevealed, and who is now responsible for what happens inside that exposure. The unit had been extraordinary. That was the truth of it, stripped of everything that was complicated about the truth. 14 men who had done things that needed doing in places where nobody else would go, under conditions that didn't permit hesitation or error. He had been young and precise and willing, and the work had shaped him in ways that he was still discovering. Not all of them bad, not all of them something he could explain at a kitchen table in the dark. He'd left because of Ella. That was the simple version. Her mother had departed when Ella was 3, so not dramatically, not with a fight, just with the slow accumulating recognition that she had not signed up for the specific loneliness of loving someone who was frequently absent and never entirely present even when he was there. She'd left, and she'd said Riker could keep Ella, which was either the greatest gift she'd ever given him or the cruelest thing she'd ever said, depending on the day he was having. He'd taken Ella, and he'd made the calls, and he'd walked away from the work, and he'd spent 6 years building something small and specific and real. He had not entirely left the work behind in the ways that mattered. You don't leave a thing like that behind. You carry it forward into the next configuration of your life, and you find out what it means when it isn't a job anymore. Yesterday it had meant 3 men on a marble floor and a woman who could leave a hotel lobby with the evidence she'd spent 6 months gathering. He supposed there were worse things it could have meant. At 5:40 he heard Ella's alarm go off upstairs. At 5:48 he heard her in the bathroom. At 6:02 she came downstairs in her school clothes with her hair loose. She hadn't brushed it yet, which was the detail that betrayed how recently she'd gotten up. And she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him sitting at the table in the dark with his coffee, and she said, with the directness of a child who has learned not to soften everything, "You couldn't sleep." "I slept some. But you've been sitting here for a while." "Yeah." She came in and got herself a glass of water and sat across from him. She didn't turn the light on. They sat in the dark kitchen together for a moment with the sound of the furnace doing its thing in the background. "Are you okay?" she said. Not the way adults say it sometimes, as a formality. The way she said it, which was with her full attention and an expectation of a real answer. He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, dark eyes in the dark kitchen, watching him with that particular quality of hers. The stillness she'd developed out of necessity and hadn't yet been able to fully convert into something chosen. He was going to keep working on that. He had a lot of years left to work on it. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." She studied him for one more moment, applying whatever internal metric she used for these assessments. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and reached for her backpack. "I need $5 for the book fair," she said. He got up to get his wallet. Claire Adiemi was not what he'd expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected exactly. Something more aggressive, maybe? The forward-leaning energy of a reporter who'd spent 8 months on a financial crime story and was now sitting across from the most human interest angle she'd probably ever had dropped in her lap. But the woman who met him at the coffee shop on Renner Street was in her late 30s, quietly dressed, with a small recorder she placed on the table and immediately asked permission to use, and a legal pad she kept closed for the first 20 minutes, because, she said, the off-the-record part was the part where she needed to understand who she was talking to before she wrote a single word. "I've been covering the Meridian Capital Partners story since before Sinclair Global was formally involved," she said. "I've looked at the financial architecture of this thing for 8 months. I understand the money. What I don't understand yet is the morning at the Aurelia Grand, not the forensic version, which I can piece together from what's public, but the human version. Why a maintenance contractor with no stake in any of it crossed a hotel lobby." "You could write it without the human version," Riker said. "I could. It would be a worse story." She looked at him directly. I'm not trying to be cute about this. The worst story gets read by fewer people, and fewer people understanding what happened means the full weight of what Vivian Sinclair spent 6 months building doesn't land the way it should. The criminal network is significant. The arrests are significant. But people don't mobilize around financial crime. They mobilize around the human thing inside it. A pause. You're the human thing inside it. He looked at the recorder. Off the record still? Off the record still. He looked at his coffee. I have a daughter, he said. She was in the lobby with me. The way those 3 men were positioned around that woman, it was the same posture, the same geometry, the thing that says you're not leaving until we decide you can. My daughter knows that geometry. She learned it before she should have had to. He paused. I don't explain well why I moved. I moved because that's what you do when you see it. Claire Adeyemi didn't write anything. She looked at him for a moment. That's the story, she said quietly. The geometry of it. The fact that you recognized it, she said, and that you were the only one in that lobby who did something about what they recognized. He didn't confirm or deny that. He wrapped his hands around the mug. My daughter's name stays out of it, he said. Her face is in the video, and I can't undo that. Her name doesn't go in print. Agreed, without reservation. My background. The government work. I'll tell you it existed. I won't tell you the details, and you won't speculate about them in print. She considered this. I can say former military background. General. Former service, he said. Nothing more specific. Former service, she agreed. She opened the legal pad. Can I turn on the recorder? He nodded. They talked for 45 minutes. He was careful. Not evasive, just measured. The way he'd learned to give information that was true and complete within its defined perimeter. He talked about the lobby. He talked about the positioning of the 3 men and what it communicated. He talked about nobody else moving, not from cruelty necessarily, but from the particular social paralysis that falls over a room when something wrong is happening in a space that's supposed to be safe and expensive and controlled. He did not talk about the tattoo. He did not talk about Victor Crane beyond what was already public. He did not talk about Arthur Briggs or the statement he'd given 2 days prior in a nondescript federal building on the west side of the city, 3 hours with 2 attorneys present, his own and one from the government side, the whole thing recorded and sealed and placed in a file that would contribute to a case he would probably never see the resolution of in any public form. When they were done, Claire Adeyemi turned off the recorder and sat back. One more thing, she said. Off the record again, if you want. Go ahead. The video has been viewed 4.2 million times as of this morning, she said. That's not a news story anymore. That's a cultural moment. People are responding to it the way they respond to things that touch something they've stopped believing in. She paused. The comments they're not what you usually see under a viral video. People are writing about their fathers, about times they needed someone to step in and nobody did. She stopped herself. I'm not trying to make you feel the weight of it. I'm trying to make sure you understand that what's coming next is going to be larger than what's already happened. I know, he said. You seem very calm about it. I'm aware of it, he said. Worried and aware are different things. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something on the legal pad, not from the interview, just a note to herself. He didn't ask what it was. They shook hands outside the coffee shop. The October air had turned sharper overnight, the kind of cold that had made its decision and intended to stay. She walked toward a parking structure. He walked toward the truck. He had a job in the afternoon, one of the Sinclair Global properties Dana Reeves had sent over, a 12-story mixed-use building in the Commerce District that needed a full mechanical assessment before the year-end service contract decision. He'd looked at the building specs the night before and made notes. It was good work, the kind he knew how to do without thinking about anything else. He was grateful for that. The story ran 4 days later. He read it on his phone at the kitchen table, alone, early morning. Ella was still asleep. Claire Adeyemi had written it with a precision that surprised him. Not the precision of restraint, but the precision of someone who had understood what mattered and put it in the right place. She had his quotes about the lobby, the geometry of it, the fact that he'd moved because that's what you do. She had context about Vivian Sinclair and the investigation. She had a paragraph about Ella, not by name, not with details, just he was there with his daughter, 10 years old, who watched the whole thing from a chair where he told her to stay and did not move. And something about the way it was written made it land harder than anything else in the piece. The article was shared 600,000 times in the first 18 hours. He knew this because Dana Reeves texted him to say so, and because the number of unknown calls on his phone had become something he'd simply stopped engaging with, turning the ringer off entirely and relying on texts from numbers he recognized. Vivian called that morning. Not Dana, Vivian directly, from the number he'd stored in his phone after their meeting in the Meridian district. "Did you read it?" she said. "Yeah. How are you feeling about it?" "It's accurate," he said. "She did what she said she'd do." "She usually does." A pause. "Riker, can I call you that?" "Sure." "I'm going to tell you something that I'd like you to know before it becomes public, because you're part of the reason it's happening, and you deserve to know the shape of it in advance." Her voice had the quality it always had, composed, direct, the kind of voice that had learned not to waste words. "I'm announcing a foundation next week. Ethical leadership, protection of whistleblowers, training programs for security and law enforcement professionals around de-escalation and use of appropriate force. The legal structure is already in place. The funding is committed." She paused. "I'd like to name it in a way that acknowledges what happened at the hotel without being exploitative about it. I'd like to use the paper crane as the symbol." He was quiet for a moment. "The crane is Ella's," he said. "I know, that's why I'm asking your permission." He thought about Ella at the kitchen table with her origami square, the pale blue paper, the way she folded each crease with the specific care of someone who believed the precision mattered, the way she'd pressed the finished bird into his chest pocket and patted it once. "So you come back?" "Let me ask her," he said. "Of course. I'll call you back." He waited until Ella came downstairs. She was half asleep, the way she always was for the first 10 minutes of the morning, moving through the kitchen with the careful, slow deliberateness of someone navigating a room they know by feel. She poured cereal. She poured milk. She sat down and ate 3 bites before she looked up and registered that he was watching her. "What?" she said. He told her. Not the whole thing, not the foundation structure or the legal architecture or the funding commitments, just, there's a woman named Vivian who wants to start something that helps people, and she wants to use the crane as the symbol. Ella listened with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "The crane means something to her?" she said. "It means something to her." "Does she know it's supposed to keep people safe?" "I think that's exactly why she wants to use it." Ella put the spoon down. She looked at her cereal bowl for a moment, then out the window at the backyard where the birch tree stood and the fence board he'd replaced last week was still a slightly different color from the boards around it because the new wood hadn't weathered yet. "Okay," she said. "You're sure?" She looked at him. "If it helps people, it should be used," she said, with the flat simplicity of a child who hasn't yet learned to complicate things that are actually simple. "That's the whole point of it." He called Vivian back. He told her yes. She was quiet for a moment after he said it. "Thank you," she said. "Both of you." The announcement of the Sinclair Foundation made national news. Not because of the money, though the funding commitments were substantial, but because of the timing, the context, and because someone in Vivian's communications team had created a visual identity around the crane symbol that was clean and spare and immediately recognizable, the geometric bird from Ella's folded paper rendered in a few precise lines, and the image moved through the internet with the particular velocity of things that resonate before people have fully processed why. Within 48 hours, there were crane images appearing in places nobody had planned for. Paper cranes left outside police precincts in 3 cities. A chalk drawing of the symbol on the steps of a courthouse in another state. A high school in the Midwest whose student body had folded 1,000 cranes and strung them across the cafeteria ceiling for reasons that were hard to explain, except that the students themselves said it meant something about not looking away. Riker read about these things in the same way he read about everything connected to that morning, with a kind of removed, careful attention, like watching a fire from a distance that he hoped was sufficient. He was not unaffected by them. He wasn't built in the kind of way that let you be unaffected by a high school hanging 1,000 paper cranes and saying it's about not looking away. But being affected was different from being consumed by it, and he held that line. He was in the crawl space of the Commerce District building when Dana Reeves called about the television request. He let it go to voicemail. He finished the assessment, found 2 significant ductwork issues in the East Wing that the previous contractor had documented as resolved. They were not resolved. And wrote them up in his report with photographs and a repair estimate and sent it to the property manager before he'd even left the parking structure. He listened to Dana's voicemail on the drive home. 3 separate morning news programs wanted to book him. 2 documentary production companies had reached out to Sinclair Global asking about access. A book agent had somehow gotten his email address. He didn't know how. He'd changed it twice in the past week, and sent a message with a subject line that said, "Your story deserves to be told in full," which he deleted without opening. He called Dana back. "I'm not doing television," he said. "I'll pass that along." The documentary inquiries, Ms. Sinclair is handling those herself. She's not granting access to anyone who wants to make it about the hotel incident rather than the foundation's work. You don't have to be involved in those decisions. I appreciate that. A pause. Mr. Steele, I've been in communications for 15 years. I've worked with politicians and executives and people who did genuinely extraordinary things and then spent considerable energy turning them into a brand. Another pause. You are the first person I've worked with who has consistently made my job easier by asking for less. He didn't know what to say to that. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, she said. But yes. The statement he'd given to Arthur Briggs contributed to proceedings he didn't follow closely. Marcus kept him loosely informed, not details, just the general temperature. The case was moving. Crane was cooperating with some things and fighting others, which was the pattern of a man who had calculated his position and was trading information for reduced exposure in the specific way of people who had operated at the intersection of legality and its absence for long enough to understand the value of what they knew. The Meridian Capital Partners ownership group was being systematically dismantled through asset seizure and parallel investigations in 2 other jurisdictions. It was going to take years. Most of it would never be in a news story. That was fine. Riker hadn't done what he'd done for the resolution of a case. The resolution would happen or it wouldn't, at whatever speed institutional processes moved. He'd crossed a lobby because 3 men wouldn't stop and someone needed them to stop. That was still the whole story from where he sat. What changed in the weeks following was smaller and more personal and harder to articulate. The Sinclair Global contracts came through, 2 of the 3 properties, substantial annual service agreements that represented the largest single expansion of his business since he'd started it. He hired a second technician, a young man named Dario, who had completed his certification the previous spring and had been working for a larger company that treated him like a number, which was the kind of detail Riker had personal feelings about. He ordered a second set of tools and let Dario use the newer truck while he took the older one, which was a choice Dario found confusing until he understood that it was standard Riker Steel policy to take the worst option for himself without making it a statement. He bought Ella a coat, a proper winter coat, the kind with the real insulation and the hood that actually stayed up. He drove to the store on a Saturday with her, and she tried on 4 of them and chose the dark green one because it had pockets she could actually put her hands in, rather than the decorative pockets that were apparently a pervasive problem in the design of children's outerwear that Riker had not previously been aware of. These, she said, demonstrating the depth of the pockets, can fit a full origami square. That was a factor in the decision? It should always be a factor, she said, with complete seriousness. He bought the coat. It was a Saturday afternoon in November, 3.5 weeks after the Aurelia Grand, and they were standing outside the store on Hallowell Street, in the beginning of what was probably going to become the first real snow of the season. The air had that particular pressure to it, the sky the specific gray that meant business, and Ella was wearing the new coat and her hands were in the pockets and she looked warm and uncomplicated. His phone buzzed. He checked it. Vivian, the Foundation's first training cohort starts Monday. 48 security professionals from 6 departments. I wanted you to know. He typed back. How's it going? A pause. Then, we're building it. It's messy and slow, and it's going to take years. So yes, it's going well. He put the phone away. Who is that? Ella said. Vivian. Ella nodded. She pulled her hands out of the pockets and looked up at the sky. It's going to snow, she said. Yeah. Can we get hot chocolate? There's a place 2 blocks up. They walked. The first few flakes started coming down before they reached the corner. Not committed yet, just the leading edge of it, the sky testing its intentions. Ella had her face tilted up slightly in the way she always did when it first started snowing, a habit from when she was very small that she hadn't grown out of yet. He hoped she didn't. Some habits deserve to outlast childhood. The hot chocolate place was a narrow shop run by a woman who recognized him immediately. He could see it happen, the small recalibration, the moment of, I know you from somewhere, followed by the more specific recognition. But to her considerable credit, she said nothing about it and just asked him what size and whether he wanted the dark or the milk chocolate version. He said dark. Ella said milk. They stood at the counter and drank them. Dad? Ella said. Yeah. At school, my teacher, Mrs. Okafor, she talked about the foundation in class, about what it does. A pause. She showed us the symbol. He looked at her. She was looking at the hot chocolate. She didn't know it was mine, Ella said. The crane. She didn't know. A beat. I didn't say anything. Why not? She shrugged, not the dismissive shrug, the thoughtful one, the one that meant she was working through something that didn't have clean edges yet. Because she was talking about what it means, what it stands for. And that felt like it didn't need to be about me. She looked up. Does that make sense? He thought about a foundation that was messy and slow and going to take years. He thought about 1,000 paper cranes strung across a cafeteria ceiling. He thought about a woman pressed against a wall who'd asked 3 times to be left alone while a lobby full of people looked away. He thought about what it meant to do something that mattered and then step back and let it mean what it meant without holding on to your ownership of it. Yeah, he said, it makes sense. She looked satisfied. She went back to the hot chocolate. Outside the window, the snow was committing now. Real flakes, real accumulations starting on the windowsills and the parked cars and the sidewalk outside. In an hour, Cortlandt Street would have an inch on it, and he'd need to find the ice scraper he hadn't seen since last February, and which was probably under the seat of the older truck. One of the other customers in the shop had looked over at him twice. He caught it the second time. The look of recognition, the processing, the decision-making. The man was in his 40s, dressed for the weather, with a kid about Ella's age at his elbow who was more interested in the menu board than anything else. The man caught Riker's eye. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a single, deliberate nod. The kind that's not casual and not effusive, just a direct acknowledgement between 2 people who understand that words would make it smaller. Riker nodded back. The man turned back to his kid. Riker turned back to Ella. You want another one? He said. She considered the cup. Yeah, she said. But the dark kind this time. I want to see what the difference is. He went back to the counter. Bulch. That night, after Ella was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the light on and looked at the list on his phone. The ongoing perpetual list that was partly practical and partly the thing that kept him anchored to the specific texture of his life. The furnace needed a full service, not just tolerating its sound. The fence board had been replaced, but the gate latch was loose. Dario needed to be paid for the first full month, and he needed to make sure the health insurance contribution was set up correctly because he'd said he'd match a portion of it, and he hadn't followed through on the paperwork yet. Ordinary things, accounted for, manageable. He added ice scraper, check under truck seat. He added Ella, library books overdue, probably. He put the phone down and looked at the table and thought about what Marcus had said 3 weeks ago. Take care of yourself. The version that meant more than the surface. He thought about how he'd answered, I know what I'm protecting, and whether that was still true, and he decided it was. More true now than before, maybe. Not despite everything that had happened, but partly because of it. The furnace made it sound. He got up and went to bed. Winter came down hard on the city that year, the way it did every few years when it had something to prove. By December, the snow had stopped being charming and started being structural. packed into the gutters, layered on the rooftops, turning the sidewalks on Cortlandt Street into a negotiation between ice and the salt Riker spread every morning before Ella left for school. He'd gotten into the habit of doing it early, before 6, while the street was still quiet, and the only sound was the scrape of the shovel and the occasional car moving carefully through what the plows had left behind. It was meditative in the way that physical, purposeful work tended to be meditative. It didn't require thought, so thought happened in the margins, quiet and unsupervised. He thought, in those early mornings, about a lot of things. About Dario, who had turned out to be a better technician than his certifications had suggested, with an instinctive grasp of airflow dynamics that Riker recognized as the kind of thing you couldn't teach, only cultivate. About the Sinclair Global contracts, which had stabilized the business in a way that let him stop doing the mental arithmetic he'd been doing for years, the quiet calculation of whether the numbers would hold through the slow months. About Marcus, who had called twice since October, once to say that the Crane case was progressing and once just to talk, which was unusual enough to be its own kind of signal. The signal that said we are both still here, and that is not nothing. He thought about the morning at the Aurelia Grand the way you think about a thing that divided time. The before and the after of it. Not with drama. Just with the acknowledgement that some mornings don't stay mornings. Some of them become the thing you measure other things against. He thought about Vivian. That one was harder to categorize, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it. They had spoken 11 times since October. Some of those conversations were practical. The Sinclair Global properties, the service contracts, the logistics of a business relationship that was growing into something substantial. But the conversations had a tendency to migrate, to move from the practical into something else, and he had started to notice the migration and to not redirect it, which was itself a kind of decision. She called one evening in the second week of December when Ella was at the kitchen table working on a history project about the Transcontinental Railroad, and he took the phone out to the back porch because the night was clear and cold and he needed the air. The second cohort is registered, she said. 63 professionals this time, from 8 departments instead of 6. That's significant growth in 2 months. The first cohort did something I didn't anticipate, she said. They went back to their departments and talked about it. Not formally, just talked about it, the way people talk about things that change something for them. Word spread. A pause. One of the participants, a security supervisor from a transit authority, he told me the training was the first time in his career that anyone had explicitly discussed the difference between authority and force. He said he'd been doing the job for 19 years and nobody had ever put that distinction in front of him as a teachable thing. Her voice carried something in it that wasn't quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. 19 years. That's the gap, Riker said. That's exactly the gap. We train people to respond, but not to decide. And the decision, when to move, when to stand still, when to step forward, and when to step back, that's the whole job. The response is just the execution. He looked at the backyard. The birch tree was bare, its branches holding a thin line of snow along each one. Ella had put seeds under it again last week, despite his gentle observation that birds in December in this climate were limited. She'd said she was keeping the option open for any bird that happened to be around. I want to ask you something, Vivian said, and I want you to know that there's no professional angle to this. I'm not asking because of the foundation or the contracts. He waited. Would you be willing to come to the first cohort's graduation ceremony? Next Friday. It's small, just the participants, some of their supervisors, a few people from the foundation board. A pause. I'd like you to meet them, not as a symbol, just as the person who, as the reason any of this exists. He was quiet for a moment. Ella too, Vivian added. If she'd want to come. He looked back through the kitchen window. Ella had her head bent over the railroad project, her pencil moving in the focused, deliberate way that meant she was somewhere between understanding it and being frustrated by it. She had a smear of ink on her left hand that she hadn't noticed yet. I'll ask her, he said. Hush. Ella's response to the invitation was practical and immediate. Will I have to give a speech? She asked. No. Will people make a big deal about the crane? Probably some of them. She considered this with the expression she used for things that were slightly inconvenient but not deal breakers. Okay, she said. Can I bring one to give her? Vivian. You want to fold her one? She should have one, Ella said simply. If she's going to use the symbol, she should have the actual thing, not a logo version, a real one. He had nothing to add to that reasoning. Sure, he said. She went back to the Transcontinental Railroad. The ceremony was held in a conference facility on the 12th floor of the Sinclair Global Building downtown, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of view that reminded you the city was larger than whatever part of it you normally moved through. 63 folding chairs faced a small, raised platform. The participants were there in various combinations of their professional attire, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some in the deliberate in-between of people who hadn't been sure what was appropriate. Riker arrived with Ella 10 minutes before it started, which was his standard, early enough to see the space before it filled, not so early as to stand around. Vivian met them at the door herself, which he hadn't expected. She was in a dark blazer and her hair was down the way it had been at the Meridian District meeting, and she looked, he thought, like a person who had spent 2 months building something and could see the early shape of what it was becoming. She shook his hand. She looked at Ella. I've been looking forward to meeting you, she said. Not the way adults sometimes said it to children, with the performative enthusiasm that kids could smell from 6 feet away. She said it the way she said most things, directly, meaning it. Ella studied her with the frank assessment she applied to new adults. I brought you something, she said, and reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded paper crane, pale gold this time, not the blue she used for her father. She held it out. Vivian took it with both hands. She looked at it for a moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't the boardroom composure. There was something underneath it, something that had been compressed for a very long time under the weight of a woman who had decided early that showing it wasn't something she could afford. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady, just. The color means something different from the blue, Ella said. Blue is protection. Gold is... I use it for people who are doing something new, something that didn't exist before. Vivian looked at her. How long have you been making these? Since I was 7. A pause. I make one for my dad every day. He has a lot of blue ones. Do you ever run out of paper? I buy it in bulk now, Ella said. From the craft store on Millway. They know me there. The corner of Vivian's mouth moved. It was not a polished smile. It was the real kind, the one that arrived before you could manage it. Come in, she said. I want to introduce you to some people. The 63 people in that room were not a category. That was the thing Riker understood in the first 10 minutes, watching them talk to each other and to the foundation staff and to the board members who moved through the space with the careful deference of people who knew they were guests in a room that belonged to someone else's experience. They were transit supervisors and hospital security coordinators and hotel safety directors, the last category carrying, he suspected, a specific weight they didn't discuss. And sheriff's deputies from rural counties and officers from city precincts, and one woman who ran security for a network of domestic violence shelters and who had driven 4 hours to attend because the training, she told him when they were introduced, had changed how her entire team thought about the difference between physical intervention and emotional de-escalation. We were good at the physical part, she said. Her name was Sandra Reyes, and she had the worn, specific competence of someone who had been doing a hard job for a long time without sufficient support. That's what the training usually covers. But the women in our shelters, they're not scared of being hurt most of the time. They're scared of being controlled. They're scared of someone taking away their choices. And if our team responds to every tense situation by defaulting to physical authority, we're recreating the dynamic they came to us to escape. She paused. The training made that explicit. For the first time, someone put it in a room and said, "This is what you're doing when you lead with force, and it's wrong, and here's why, and here's what to do instead." Riker listened to her without speaking. He didn't have the right words for what she was describing. He knew the shape of it from the inside. The training he'd had, the years of learning when force was the answer and when it was the failure of every other option. But he didn't have her language for it. The language of people who worked not in places where the stakes were geopolitical, but in places where the stakes were a woman with 2 children trying to get through a Tuesday. "Thank you for coming," was what he said. It wasn't enough, and he knew it. "No," she said, and she was very direct about it. Thank you for being the example. She paused. Not because you were fast or because you were trained, because you stopped, you assessed, you gave them the chance to stop. A beat. Most people don't do that. Most people who could do what you did, they don't do that. He thought about the lobby, the 3 chances he'd given them. The man in the middle who'd looked at him with that measured gaze and decided Riker was a problem to be removed rather than a person making a reasonable request. They didn't take the chance, he said. No, but you gave it. She looked at him with something clear and level in her eyes. That's what we're teaching, that sequence, the giving of it. Vivienne spoke to the group for about 20 minutes. She was good at it. Not the polished good of a practiced speaker, but the better kind. The kind where you could tell the person was thinking while they were talking, that the words were being made in real time from things they actually believed. She talked about the gap between authority and force. She talked about the 19 years before someone named the distinction. She talked about institutions that trained people to respond and forgot to train them to decide. And then she said something that Riker hadn't expected and that he would think about for a long time afterward. She said, "The person who walked across a hotel lobby in October didn't do it because he was trained to. He did it because he had already decided, at some point before that morning, what kind of person he was going to be. The training gave him the capacity. The decision gave him the reason." She paused. That's what we're trying to build here. Not a program that tells you what to do. A framework that helps you figure out who you already are, and then gives you the tools to be that person under pressure, when it costs something. She didn't look at him when she said it. He was grateful for that. Ella, sitting beside him, leaned over slightly and said, very quietly near his ear, "She's good." "Yeah," he said. "She is." Afterward, when the formal part was done, and people were moving around the room with coffee and the particular loosened energy of a group that had spent 2 months in something together and was now at its end, Vivienne found him near the windows. The city spread out below them, gray and white, and lit in the flat December light, the kind of city that looked like a problem from above and felt like home from inside it. "How did it feel?" she said. "Strange," he said honestly. "Good, but strange. I'm not used to being in a room because of something I did." "You should probably get used to it. There's a second cohort." "Sandra Reyes," he said. Vivienne nodded. "She's one of the best participants we've had. She came in skeptical and she left with a changed program. Those are the ones that matter most. The skeptics who get there." He looked at the city. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "The second cohort. The training curriculum." He paused, working out how to say it. "There's a gap in what you're building, I think. You have the philosophy right, the decision before the action, the distinction between force and authority. But the people doing this job need to practice the decision under conditions that feel real, not simulated scenarios with obvious answers." He turned from the window. "The hardest moments are the ambiguous ones, when you can't read the room, when there are multiple people involved and the threat isn't clear, when someone is scared and expressing it as aggression, and you have to distinguish between the two in about 4 seconds. She was watching him with attention. "I can help build that part," he said. "Not the theory. I don't have the language for the theory. Reyes and people like her have that. But the practical application. What it actually feels like to be in that 4 seconds. How to train your body to slow down when your instinct is to speed up." He paused. "If you want it." She didn't answer immediately, which he appreciated. She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "I want it." A pause. "I was hoping you'd get there on your own. I didn't want to ask." "Why not?" "Because I needed it to be your choice, not something I pulled you toward." She looked at him steadily. "I've spent 6 months watching what happens when someone with power decides what's best for someone without it. I'm careful about that now." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm making the choice," he said. "I know." She looked out at the city. "There's one more thing I want to say, and then I'll stop because I think you find this kind of conversation uncomfortable." That's accurate. The foundation is real, and the work is real, and none of that is contingent on anything personal. She said it cleanly, without performance. which was the only way she said things. But I want to be honest with you about the fact that the line between professional and personal has been getting less distinct for a few months, and I'd rather say that out loud than pretend it isn't there. He looked at the city. He thought about 11 conversations. He thought about the migration from practical to something else, and his choice not to redirect it. "I'm aware of it," he said. "Is it a problem?" He took a moment, a real one, not a performed pause. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." She nodded. Something shifted in her face, small and real. "Okay," she said. "Good." They stood there for another minute, looking at the city. He could see from this angle the roofline of the Aurelia Grand 9 blocks east. The pale stone building closed now, its windows dark, its brass fixtures tarnished in some photograph he'd seen. The red awning rolled up and stored while asset seizure proceedings moved forward at their institutional pace. He'd heard from Marcus last week that the ownership group's lawyers were in settlement discussions. The full legal resolution would take years. 3 of the 7 principal defendants had already taken plea agreements. Victor Crane was cooperating. That was the word Marcus had used. Cooperating. With the particular implication of the word in that context, which was that a man had looked at what was arrayed against him and made the calculation that the time for being difficult had passed. The Aurelia Grand would either be sold to new owners or sit empty for a long time. He didn't know which, and he found he didn't particularly care either way. He'd signed the maintenance contract for the hotel on a Tuesday morning in October and driven there in a truck that needed new brake pads, and he'd walked out into the same cold air he'd driven through. But the air had a different character in it somehow, the specific character of a morning that had changed its mind about being ordinary. He thought about the paper crane in his pocket. He thought about Ella at 7 years old pressing it against his chest and saying, "So you come back." He thought about all the mornings since, the cranes that had accumulated in a small wooden box on his dresser, pale blue mostly, some gold, 2 red ones she'd made on days she said she felt like something different, hundreds of them. The physical record of 10,000 departures and returns, all of them unremarkable, all of them the whole point. He took Ella out for dinner after the ceremony. Nothing elaborate, a Thai place on Garfield Street that they'd been going to for 2 years, the kind of place where the owner knew their order and the lighting was warm and nobody looked at anyone too hard. Ella was quiet through most of the meal, which was not unusual. She was a thinker. She processed things on a timeline that was her own, and occasionally surfaced with observations that were 3 days late in delivery and exactly right in content. "I liked the woman," she said, halfway through her noodles. "Sandra Reyes." "She was good," he agreed. "She said something to me when you were talking to someone else." Ella twirled noodles around her chopstick. "She said the crane symbol means something different to her than it might mean to other people. She said to her, it means someone is watching the room." A pause. "Not like security watching. Like someone who notices when something's wrong and doesn't decide it's somebody else's problem." He looked at her. "I told her it started because I was scared my dad wouldn't come home," Ella said. She didn't make it weird. She just said, she understood that. That's exactly what it is. She paused. That all the people in that program, they're learning how to be the person who makes sure other people can come home. The restaurant was warm and the food was good, and the snow outside the window was coming down again in the patient way of December snow that had nowhere to be. He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, her dark eyes, the ones she'd gotten from her mother, her stillness, the one she'd developed out of necessity and was slowly converting into something chosen, her mind the one that processed the world in the margins and arrived 3 days later with exactly the right words. And he thought about the question of legacy. Not the version of it that ends up in public records, in foundation documentation, in sealed federal case files with his name redacted. The other version. The version that was right in front of him eating noodles and had just articulated, more precisely than he could have, the entire moral architecture of a Tuesday morning in October. "She got it right," he said. Ella nodded. "I know." She went back to her food. January brought the 3rd cohort, 71 professionals, the largest yet, and with it, Riker's first formal role in the curriculum. He had worked with Vivian and the Foundation's lead trainer, a former law enforcement psychologist named Dr. Maureen Osei, to build a 4-hour practical module that they positioned at the end of the second week, after the theoretical framework had been established, and before participants moved into the field simulation portion. He was not comfortable in front of groups. He had never been comfortable in front of groups. This was a fact he had made peace with the way you make peace with any structural limitation of your own character. You don't pretend it isn't there, you just don't let it be the reason you don't do something. The first session was rough. He was too terse in places, too much in the cadence of instruction without the cadence of teaching, which were different things. Dr. Osei had told him this would happen. She'd said, "You know the material completely, so you'll skip the steps that feel obvious to you. And those are the steps that aren't obvious to the room." She was right. He adjusted by the second hour. By the fourth hour, he had found something that wasn't natural exactly, but was functional. A version of communication that bridged his instinct for economy with the room's need for context. He talked about the 4 seconds. He talked about what happened in the body when threat was perceived, the narrowing of attention, the speeding of time, the compression of options. He talked about how the training he'd received had been built on the premise that you could teach the body to do something different in that compression, to insert a half-second of assessment before the response, to ask one question, what is actually happening here, before committing to action. He told them about a hotel lobby. He didn't tell them it was the Aurelia Grand or that they might have seen the video. He just described the situation, the woman, the men, the posture, the geometry of it, and walked them through the decision tree, the 3 requests before the physical response. The awareness of Ella across the room that had been present the whole time, not as a distraction, but as an anchor, as the reason precision mattered more than speed. The goal is not to neutralize the threat, he said. The goal is to resolve the situation. Sometimes those are the same thing. Usually they aren't. He looked at the room. You are not a weapon. You are a decision maker who has the capacity to act. The capacity is not the point. The decision is the point. Dr. Osei, watching from the side of the room, wrote something on her legal pad. Afterward, she showed it to him. It said, "Use that line to open the next session." For what? He taught the 4th cohort and the 5th. He adjusted the module each time, not dramatically, but in the specific small ways of someone who is learning to teach by teaching. Finding the places where the room went quiet in the wrong way, where questions revealed misunderstanding rather than curiosity, where his own economy of language was a wall rather than a door. He was not a natural teacher. He might never be. But he was a competent one, and competence built on genuine material had its own authority. Spring came, and the furnace made its last sound of the season, and he turned it off for the year and serviced it properly. Finally, which took an afternoon and was deeply satisfying in the specific way of fixing a thing you'd been tolerating for longer than you should have. The ice scraper went back under the truck seat. The birch tree in the backyard had leaves on it again. Small, new, the particular green of early spring that never lasted long enough. Ella was putting seeds under it again, adjusted for the season. The gate latch he fixed on a Saturday morning, while Ella sat on the back steps watching him work. She had a paper square in her hands, pale blue, folding without looking at it in the way she could now, the way you do a thing you've done enough times that the hands know it. "What's the one for today?" he said, working the screwdriver into the latch housing. "You," she said. "Obviously. I'm right here." "The crane doesn't know that," she said. "The crane just knows it's supposed to keep you here." He stopped working for a moment. He looked at his daughter on the back steps in the spring morning light, 10 years old becoming 11, folding paper with her hands while the backyard came back to life around her. And he felt the weight of the ordinary morning, the way you feel it when you've had enough extraordinary ones to understand what ordinary is worth. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked up. She gave him the look, the one that was both 10-year-old and something older than 10, the one that had been in her eyes since she was 7 and had first pressed a paper crane against his chest pocket in the driveway on Cortlandt Street. "I know," she said. "That's why I keep making them." She finished the crane and walked over and tucked it into the pocket of his work shirt. He went back to the latch. The Meridian Capital Partners case concluded its primary phase 14 months after the morning at the Aurelia Grand. 7 principal defendants received sentences ranging from 8 to 23 years. The Aurelia Grand was sold to a hospitality group with no connection to the previous ownership and reopened 18 months later under a different name with a new lobby that was, by all accounts, indistinguishable from every other expensive hotel lobby in the city, which was perhaps its own kind of statement. Riker read about the sentencing in a brief online article that Dana Reeves forwarded to him because she knew he didn't follow the coverage himself. He read it once, closed his phone, and went back to the estimate he was writing for a commercial job in the Decker neighborhood. A different building from the one with the bad ductwork and the hidden wall. A new construction that wanted a full design consultation from the ground up, which was the kind of job he preferred, the kind where you got to do it right from the beginning. He sent the estimate. He made coffee. He thought briefly about the silver-haired man in the lobby who had stared at his tattoo with that particular recognition, and whether he was among the 7. He didn't know and didn't look it up. Some questions were better left at the level of not particularly mattering. Vivian called the evening of the sentencing. "Did you see?" she said. "Dana forwarded the article. How are you feeling about it?" He thought about this honestly, the way she'd come to expect from him and the way he'd come to expect from himself in conversations with her. "Relieved it's resolved," he said. "Not particularly moved by the sentences. That's not what it was ever about." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." A pause, the comfortable kind. "How's Ella?" she said. "She's good. She's decided she wants to learn Japanese because she wants to read origami instructions in the original language rather than the translated versions." A sound from Vivian that was entirely genuine amusement. "Of course she has. She's been using an app. She already knows 20 words. "Of course she does." A pause, warmer now. "And you? How are you?" He looked around the kitchen. The list on his phone, always ongoing, had gotten shorter in some places and longer in others. That was the nature of lists, of maintenance, of a life that kept accumulating small things that needed attending to. The furnace was quiet. The gate latch held. Dario had brought in his first solo client last week, a small commercial building that he'd handled start to finish, and had called Riker afterward, sounding like a man who had just realized something about himself that he'd suspected but hadn't confirmed. "I'm good," Riker said. And then, because it was true and she'd asked honestly, and the difference between performed equanimity and the actual state had become something he was less willing to obscure than he used to be. "Better than I've been in a while, I think." "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." None. There is a thing that happens sometimes in the lives of people who have spent years being careful, where the carefulness starts to cost more than it protects, where the walls you built to keep the damage out begin to keep everything else out too, and you find yourself living in a fortified space that is safe and functional and strangely empty, and you don't notice for a long time because empty feels a lot like stable when you've been through enough instability. Riker had been in that space for 6 years. He had known it and not known it simultaneously, the way you can know something intellectually and not feel the full weight of it until the circumstances shift. The circumstances had shifted. Not cleanly, not without complication, not in the way of things that happen in stories where everything resolves with the satisfying completeness of a problem solved. He was still a man who had done things he couldn't fully explain at a kitchen table. He still woke before 5 sometimes and sat in the dark accounting for the moving parts of his life. The tattoo was still on his arm under his sleeve, and the number Marcus called from still had a 703 area code, and there was still a wooden box on his dresser with hundreds of paper cranes in it that his daughter had made out of love, and a child's specific conviction that the gesture had power. None of that had resolved. It had just found its proportion. The weight of the past was real, but the weight of the present was real too, and the present had more in it than it used to. He thought sometimes about what Sandra Reyes had said to Ella. Someone who notices when something's wrong and doesn't decide it's somebody else's problem. He thought about how that was both simple and not simple at all. How most of the things that mattered were both of those simultaneously. How the gap between knowing a thing and doing it was where character actually lived. He had not been a hero in that lobby. He was honest about that. A hero was a story you told after the fact to make the moment make sense from a distance. What he had been was a man in a specific place at a specific moment who had already, before that morning, made a decision about who he was going to be. And when the moment arrived that asked him to be that person in front of witnesses, he had simply been it. The witnesses had done the rest. The video and the news coverage, and the foundation and the 1,000 paper cranes in a cafeteria somewhere, and the 63 people in folding chairs, and Sandra Reyes driving 4 hours, and Dario calling about his first solo client, and the pale gold crane on Vivian Sinclair's desk, where she could see it when she worked. He hadn't made any of that happen. He'd crossed a lobby. Other people had made those things happen because they needed them to, because they were the kinds of things people built out of a moment that showed them something they'd stopped believing existed. He was not responsible for what they needed. He was responsible for having been the kind of person who moved when moving was required. That was the only part of the story that actually belonged to him, and it was a smaller part than the story suggested, and he was comfortable with that. On the last day of March, a Saturday, he drove Ella to a community center on the east side of the city where the Sinclair Foundation was hosting its first public workshop, an open session for anyone who wanted to come, focused on the concept of being a responsible bystander, of understanding that presence in a situation made you part of it whether you chose to engage or not. The room held about 60 people, families mostly. Some professionals in civilian clothes who were probably from previous cohorts, some teenagers, some older people who had the look of individuals who had been carrying something for a long time and had seen a flyer and thought maybe. Ella had asked to help with the paper crane demonstration, a portion of the workshop where participants would fold cranes as a tactile anchor for the discussion, something to do with their hands while they talked about difficult things. She had prepared for this with the specific thoroughness she brought to anything she decided mattered, making a folding guide that she'd illustrated herself, each step drawn clearly in her careful handwriting with the notes she thought were missing from most instructions. She stood at the front of the room beside a foundation staff member named Jess, who was 2 decades her senior and was, visibly, already somewhat in awe of the 10-year-old with the illustrated guide and the calm authority of someone who had been doing this since she was 7. The first fold is the hardest for most people, Ella told the room. She was matter-of-fact about it, not performing confidence, just being competent, which was what competence looked like when it was real. It has to be exact or the rest of the crane is off. You can't fix it later, so you slow down here, even though it feels like it should be fast. She paused. That's true for most things, she said. The first decision is the one that sets everything else. Riker was in the back of the room. He did not fold a crane. He watched his daughter teach 60 people how to begin, and he thought about the first fold, the one that had to be exact, the one you couldn't fix later, the one you slowed down for. He had made that fold, in a way, on an October morning in a hotel lobby when he'd stood up from a chair and walked across marble toward something that was wrong. He didn't know then what it would become. He'd made the fold and then the next one and then the one after that, and he'd ended up here, in the back of a room in a community center on the east side of the city, watching his daughter teach the beginning of something to 60 people who had come because they needed to believe that the beginning was possible. Ella looked up from the demonstration and found him in the back of the room. She held up a finished crane, pale blue, perfect, its wings level and its beak pointing at that slight upward angle she always managed. And she gave him a look that he knew. He put his hand over his chest pocket. The crane she'd tucked in that morning was there. She went back to teaching. He stayed in the back of the room and watched and thought about what you left behind when you lived the way you meant to. Not the monuments to it, not the foundations and the media coverage and the sealed federal files, but the actual thing, the thing you pressed into your child's understanding one ordinary morning at a time. The thing that didn't need a symbol because it was already in how they stood and how they looked at a room and how they knew, without being told, that the first fold was the one that mattered. He had been many things, a soldier, a contractor, a man who knew how to be still, a father trying, mostly failing, occasionally succeeding, always trying again. The greatest of these was the last one. He had always known that. He just understood it better now. Outside, the March afternoon was cold but had something in it, a quality the air got in late March when the cold was starting to lose confidence, when the season was still present but had begun to question its commitment. Not warm yet, not spring yet, just the beginning of the turn. The birch tree in the backyard on Cortlandt Street had new buds on it. He knew this without being there. He checked that morning before they left. Some things you knew because you'd been paying attention. That was enough. That was everything.